The Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, was created in an environment where political restraint was impossible. After September 11th, the United States faced a legitimacy crisis. The federal government had failed at its most basic promise, preventing a catastrophic attack on its own soil. Public trust collapsed overnight, and fear became the dominant political force. In that context, the TSA was not designed primarily to be effective. It was designed to be visible. Lawmakers openly described it as a temporary federal intervention. The long-term plan was to stabilize airport security standards, then return control to private contractors once the emergency passed. But institutions born in crisis rarely dissolve when the crisis fades. Once the TSA existed, it accumulated the features that make institutions permanent: a dedicated workforce, union protection, procurement contracts, training pipelines, and a congressional budget. At that point, removing it would not have meant returning to normal. It would have meant dismantling a federal employer with tens of thousands of workers. There was also a deeper political reality. Security failures are asymmetrical. If nothing happens, the institution is credited. If something does happen, the absence of the institution becomes the scapegoat. This creates a one-way ratchet, keeping the TSA politically safe. Removing it is politically radioactive. Over time, its original mission, emergency stabilization, transformed into control. The goal shifted from preventing attacks to demonstrating vigilance. The income tax and the permanent revenue state. For most of American history, an income tax was considered incompatible with Republican government. The founders believed that taxing income required intrusive surveillance of private life, and they feared that once such a mechanism existed, it would expand beyond restraint. Federal revenue came from tariffs and indirect taxes, precisely because they limited bureaucratic reach. The Civil War changed that calculus. Faced with existential conflict, the Union introduced a temporary income tax as an emergency measure. It was explicitly framed as short-term, and once the war ended, it was repealed. But the precedent mattered more than the policy. The idea that the federal government could directly tax personal income and build an administrative apparatus to do so was now normalized. When the tax returned permanently with the 16th Amendment in 1913, the real transformation wasn't the rate. It was the creation of a national revenue infrastructure capable of scaling indefinitely. Once that system existed, it became the backbone of modern governance. Wars, social program, regulatory expansion, all of it depended on a predictable, expandable revenue stream. Eliminating the income tax would not simply reduce government size, it would collapse the fiscal architecture supporting it. The institution outlived its original purpose because its secondary function became essential. It did more than just fund emergencies. It enabled the modern state. At that point, reversal became a structural impossibility. The Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve was created to solve a specific technical problem: recurring financial panics. Before 1913, the American banking system was fragile. Bank runs were common. Credit freezes could cripple the economy overnight. The Panic of 1907 exposed the danger of relying on private financiers to rescue the system in moments of crisis. The Federal Reserve was meant to be a stabilizer, not a planner. A lender of last resort, not a macroeconomic manager. But crisis logic is cumulative. Each time the Fed successfully intervened to prevent collapse, expectations shifted. Markets began to assume intervention. Policymakers began to rely on it. And gradually, the institution moved from emergency response to permanent economic stewardship. This expansion wasn't the result of a power grab. It was a function of dependency. Once the economy became structured around the assumption that the Fed would act during downturns, not acting became more dangerous than acting. Every crisis widened the Fed's mandate because failing to intervene risked systemic collapse. The institution outlived its original purpose because its presence reshaped the system it was meant to protect. Stability itself became dependent on the stabilizer. By the time people questioned its power, the alternative, removing it, appeared more destabilizing than its continued dominance. Employer-sponsored health insurance is not a law, but it functions like one. Its origin lies in wartime economic control. During World War II, wage freezes prevented companies from raising pay to attract workers. Health benefits emerged as a workaround, not a policy choice. The critical moment came when the IRS ruled that employer-provided health insurance would be tax-exempt. That single administrative decision transformed a temporary labor market hack into a structural incentive. Employers preferred benefits over wages. Workers followed coverage. Unions locked it into contract. Congress later made the tax preference permanent. At that point, the system stopped being optional. Health insurance became embedded in employment. Because the tax code punished alternatives, buying insurance independently became more expensive than receiving it through work, even when job mobility suffered as a result. The institution persisted not because it was efficient, but because unwinding it would require replacing it with something equally comprehensive. Over time, healthcare access became tied not to citizenship, but to employment status. A wartime workaround hardened into a defining feature of American life. The original purpose disappeared. The dependency remained. The Electoral College. The Electoral College was never designed for a mass democracy. It was created in a world without national campaigns, without instant communication, and without political parties functioning as they do today. Its purpose was partly logistical and partly defensive, a buffer against both regional dominance and direct popular rule. Crucially, it assumed that electors would exercise independent judgment. That assumption collapsed quickly. Political parties formed. Electors became pledged. The system's deliberative function vanished, leaving behind a mathematical mechanism divorced from its original logic. So why does it persist? Because institutions don't survive based on relevance. They survive based on advantage. The Electoral College redistributes political power geographically. Certain states gain leverage disproportionate to population. Those states benefit from the system, and they possess enough political power to block reform. Changing the Electoral College requires constitutional amendment, the highest possible barrier, ensuring that those who benefit most also control the veto. The institution outlived its purpose because it became strategically useful to powerful stakeholders. Its survival is not accidental, it's structural. The Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security represents institutional permanence through consolidation. Created after 9/11, DHS merged dozens of agencies under a single security umbrella. The goal was coordination, reducing fragmentation that allowed threats to slip through bureaucratic cracks. This was presented as an emergency reorganization, but emergency reorganizations tend to be irreversible. Once agencies merge, they share database, personnel systems, and command structures. Budgets intertwine, missions blur. Undoing the merger becomes more complex than maintaining it. DHS survived because the concept of homeland security never expired. Unlike a war, it has no endpoint. There is no victory condition that signals closure. As long as threat prevention remains politically salient, the institution remains justified, even as its scope expands beyond its original mandate. The department outlived its purpose because the purpose itself was undefined by design.